Hi, good evening. I'm Nina Nazionale, Director of Library Operations and Curator of Printed Collections at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I would like to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other generous donors. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission to make history matter. We are thrilled to have recently reopened our doors. To reserve your timed entry tickets, please visit our website at nyhistory.org. Before we launch into our program, I want to let you know that it will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We have disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. So let's get started. Many kinds of maps were produced during the Revolutionary War. Hand-drawn or manuscript maps, printed maps, based on manuscript surveys, manuscript maps drawn from existing printed maps, views of campaigns, battles, fortifications, and encampments. Some were even classified military surveys, hand-drawn and used to plan movements and attacks. Tonight, we will be looking at and looking closely at just 3 printed maps in the New York Historical Society's collection of over 12,000 maps. Not all of them from the Revolutionary War, but for tonight, we'll just look at 3 from the Revolutionary War and right after. And I selected these 3 maps because they were printed rather quickly. And we're going to look at the reasons for that, and also some just basics of maps and how they were created. Maps provided the only pictorial representation of the war at the time. Maps as conveyors of late-breaking news were not that common, which makes these maps especially noteworthy. And they are noteworthy for other reasons as well, reasons I will go into as we look at each map. The first map is the seat of war in New England by an American volunteer. This was printed by Robert Sayre and John Bennett in London on September 2nd, 1775. It shows 3 distinct views. One on the left is the overall view of military operations in Massachusetts between April and June of 1775. Top right is Boston Harbor, bottom right is Bunker Hill, Charleston, and then a close-up of Boston. It artfully presents different spheres of action and also a sequence of events, beginning with the Battle of Concord and Lexington on April 19th. And here we are, I'm just limiting us to looking at the left side of the map. And then I'm going to go in and I've highlighted what I mean by troop movements and military actions. You see what I've squared or circled in red at the top are troops from New Hampshire coming down. The bottom are troops from Rhode Island and Connecticut. And at the west is General Washington's march. The circle is around the Battle of Concord and Lexington. And here you'll see that it's hard to see, but if you look as center as possible, maybe left of center, you see 19th April, also the name of the town, Concord and Lexington. You see houses, and this is example of how engraved printed maps at the time used both text and image to convey information. It wasn't as if the images were illustrations for text, but that they were holding their own as conveyors of information. The next slide you see the March of General Washington, and there is a ton of detail here. And keep in mind that these are engravings. And what that means is that all the text, all the imagery was carved with a very sharp tool into a metal plate. And even to think about doing even a small portion of this map like that is mind-boggling to me how they did that. But these were trained map makers, and maps would start always with a survey being done in the field with surveying tools, walking, measuring, and then publishers like Sayre and Bennett would have in their shops, they would have already printed maps of the area, of Boston, of New England, so they could refer to those. But in order to get this kind of detailed as it's happening information, there had to be someone there. Obviously, you know, we're not talking TV or newspapers or social media or aerial footage or satellites. The information had to be gathered as it was happening. And here you see it's so detailed, the horses, the carts, March of General Washington. Above the actual movement, you can see in the text reads New York Grenadiers. There's also Virginia Horse Rifleman Encampment. So really no detail is left out here. It's really impressive. And what was going on here with Washington is he didn't leave Philadelphia for Boston until June 23rd. And that was after the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was on June 17th. So this map, in addition to showing the different spheres of activity, is also presenting sequential movement through time. So Washington would have been near Worcester, probably late June. He arrived in Cambridge on July 3rd. So it's just yet another, I think, really amazing thing about this map is not just the different geographical areas, but also movement through time depicted all on one map. And it really reminds me a lot of the Google views, the left being maybe the traffic, you know, you might plot your route, top right being aerial, and then bottom right being the street view, and you can pull the little yellow figure out and actually be there, a kind of you are there feeling. So now let's look at the top right, which is the plan of Boston Harbor, and you'll see it says from an actual survey, and that is you see that kind of language in maps a lot. It's a way of stating authority. It's an actual survey. And again, so much detail here. And this would be from the point of view of the British and their ships. And you see the numbers indicate those are British fathoms, that is the depth of the water. The fortification would be the American troops, militia. They had not gathered into the Continental Army just yet. They were about to under George Washington. But regardless, that fortification's looking pretty good and pretty formidable. And then all these little isles and islets that would have made it really difficult to get into to Boston Harbor by water. And now we're going to go to the bottom right in two sections. And we're going to start with the actual Bunker Hill battle in Charlestown, sorry. And the degree of graphic detail here is incredible. It's beautiful. I mean, maps are works of art, they're historic documents. There are a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I mean, this is exquisite. I mean, if you look at the fire, The coloring would have happened after the map was printed, and it would have been done by somebody who specialized in hand coloring. But you see the troops, some of them standing, some of them dead on the ground. You see fire ravaging through houses, and you see the troop formations. It's very beautiful, very detailed, and very, very impressive. At bottom, it's close-up of Boston and the Common, and here you see the British regulars have gathered in the Common and near the Liberty Tree. And so you see Newbury Street, you see Marlborough Street, you see Beacon Street, and then all the little indications of the encampment, so beautifully rendered on an engraving plate. So if we think about Bunker Hill being June 17th, and Washington, his movements from Worcester towards Boston happening end of June, early July, all of that information is on this map. But this map was printed September 2nd, 1775. At the time, travel by ship across the Atlantic would take an average of 7 weeks. So as I mentioned, Robert Sayre and Joseph Bennett, their shop was very established. They would have had a library of printed maps so they could reference those to see what the lay of the land was in Massachusetts and Boston and Charlestown. But they had to get written descriptions and or hand-drawn descriptions of all these details of where the troops are coming from, what their route is, the fact of the fires. So it's just exceptionally impressive how quickly they did this. And they knew what they were doing by putting the 2nd September 1775 on there. It's a selling point. They want to be the map makers, the printers with this just in. Because as I said, at the time, the only way that people in London would get visual representation of what was going on, 3,500 miles away, would be through this many-step process of the surveys in combination with existing maps, in combination with intel gathered by British military. And also to keep in mind is that maps from the very start of the war, as we just saw in Massachusetts in 1775, and the very end in Virginia in 1781, were the most popular of the printed maps. So here we have a plan of the entrance of Chesapeake Bay with James and York Rivers. This was printed by William Faden, very famous printer at the time. And this one, as the previous, has the exact day of printing, not just month, not just year, but the exact day. So you can see that most of the sphere of action is in the center of the map. I'm going to go a little closer on that. And then even closer, wait, let me go back and just so you get a sense of Gloucester is left towards the top. And looking at it more closely, by 1781, France was a very important part of the American efforts to win the war. And they had joined forces officially at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. And a decision was made in Phillipsburg a bit later to, instead of trying to attack New York metropolitan area again, that they would go south. And what you see here is the French and American troops have establish themselves on land, and the French frigates are on the water. The American Army did not have a navy. They were an army. So having the French as allies was fundamental to winning the war. And what I've circled in red in honor of the redcoats are British ships, and there are not many of them. So you've got the French and Americans on land, you've got the French on water, and then moving a little bit towards the right, if you imagine the full map in front of you, look at these French fleets, look at all of these ships. And again, as is typical for the time, you don't just have illustrations of ships, you have text that say French ships of the line under, now I can't read it, de bars. And then, you know, the place names are identified. It doesn't have quite as much detail as the previous map, but still it's very detailed. So this map, which was printed on November 26, 1781, it would have been almost done by the time it was printed, because as it turned out, news of the surrender of Cornwallis, the British, to the Americans on October 19th, 1781, arrived in London on the 25th of November, 1781. So Faden, he was smart, he was a businessman, he was well connected. He would have started this map and left certain details out. And I circled in the beginning of October, because that's something that he could have put in at the last minute. The thing about copper plate engravings is that it's possible to reuse and it's possible to change things. So it's quite likely that in the beginning of October, the respective positions in the beginning of October was added at the last minute, along with the date of publication. Oops, sorry. And again, you see by an officer, and many officers were trained surveyors. It's something they would have learned at the academy, military school academies, and also in the field. And so often you don't know exactly who it is until you start doing more research, but it also lends the validity and the authenticity of someone who was there. Now, the Battle of Yorktown was the last major battle of the American Revolution, but the treaty that decided that the war was over was not officially signed until September of 1783. So, in looking at our next map, a new and correct map of North America, with the West India Islands divided according to preliminary articles of peace, signed at Versailles, January 20th, 1783, what you're seeing is a bit of jumping the gun. Not completely, because the French and the Americans and the Spanish did meet in September 1782, and there was a preliminary agreement signed in January. But to put that in the title and to use what is, well, it's a recycled map. This map originally was created by Emmanuel Bowen in 1763, and the reason for it was the treaty signed that ended the French and Indian War. So these giant copper plates, and they're in sections, and they were printed from plates onto 2 sheets top and bottom. And each sheet is about 2 feet high and 6 feet wide. So when you see these together on a wall, it's 4 feet high and 6 feet wide. And I should say, getting back to our New England map just for a moment, that was printed from 2 plates onto 1 sheet of paper. In this case, it would be at least 2, if not 3 plates for both the top and the bottom. But these plates were created in 1763, and they were created to depict a completely different treaty for a completely different war. So not only is it's making a big to-do about the preliminary articles of peace, which is, again, it's not a bad thing to do, but it's definitely to sell the map. And out of excitement of, news of the day. And as I said, this was the only way that people in England would have gotten this information visually. There's no other way. So here we have the new and correct map, and you see at the bottom, it's laid down according to the latest surveys and corrected from the original materials. So that is the reference to Emmanuel Bowen and his map. And the maps were printed, there were different printings over different editions, different issues. He initially published the 1763 map in 1763, but the printing that Sayre and Bennett used for this map, this updated map, was from 1779. So there's a lot of details, always a lot of details, and especially in a map so large, it is tempting to just look at the overall information, the overall beauty of it. So what they did in January 1783 was to indicate that they had changed some things. So the divisions in this map are colored according to the preliminaries signed at Versailles. The red indicates the British possessions, the green those of the United States, blue what belongs to French, and yellow what belongs to Spaniards. And again, this is conveying information visually. In this case, it's the color scheme. So they did change that on the 1783 map, and they made a note of it. But what's fascinating to me is that I don't expect you to be able to see this. I know how dense this is. These are the articles of the treaty. And the thing about these articles, you can see a bit, the 4th, 6th, 7th, 9th article are shown. These are from 1763. So in their haste to get this gorgeous new, in quotes, map out, they added the note about the color scheme and the color coding, and they did indicate it was new and correct, but all of these fine detail of text. I'm going to go back to the big map. So all the lettering and all the text is wrong, basically. It's from 1763. And when I found that out, I was charmed and fascinated by it. And further, the bottom half of the map wasn't changed at all. The top half, they did add the note at the top center left. They did change the title within the cartouche, the decorative border with the title in this within it, but they left the bottom map. They left the copper plate exactly the same as it was when it was used to print a map depicting 1763 treaty in 1779. So there's a lot going on with maps always, and I really look forward to your questions. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go to the questions. Yes, the first question I'm taking is, wasn't the main action on Breed's Hill rather than Bunkers Hill? Absolutely right. And it's just every second and every minute of every hour of every day in these kinds of battles was significant. And I decided, rather than going into the sort of military maneuvers and more military history, that I would stick more with the material culture that is the magnificent maps generated during the revolution. But that's perfect that you asked that, because yeah, they were adjacent. And sometimes it's Bunkers Hill, sometimes it's bunkers of singular possessive, sometimes it's just plural without the possessive apostrophe. And you know, everything. And one of the other things I really love about maps is that although there's consistency, there's also a lot of inconsistency. Who purchased maps in the 1700s? How lucrative a profession was map making? I want to spend more time on this, and I haven't had the chance yet. They would have been someone established like Faden and Sarah and Bennett would have been making a healthy living off of this. Who purchased them? I would say middle class to upper class. They were valued because they very much were commemorative, especially the two battle maps I showed you. And it would be something you would definitely treasure. And if you were one of the first people to buy the map, you know, it would have been impressive to have that to show people. Let's see. Okay. Another question. Were all the maps hand colored? Were any separate color plates printed? I can't quite understand that. No, they weren't all hand colored by any means at all. And there was no, maybe that's two-tone sheet. I can't quite read the sentence. There wasn't any color printing at the time, so it would have been black and white with the way the engravings were inked up and printed. Okay. Are the illustrations in the 1783 map from 1763, or were they added? They are from 1763, and yesterday I knew who had done the artwork, and I'm sorry, but I've forgotten. So you know, if you want to shoot me an email, nnazionale@nyhistory.org, I can give you more information. How did the map makers get the information to create the large map from prior ones? Yeah, yes, that's true. Something of the size of the last map I showed you. I mean, that's it. North America, you know, these would be from their own supply, their own library of existing maps. And in some cases, like the treaty, they use the actual copper engraved plates to print the newer map. They just changed some of the details. So how did map get the information? So the other information they would have needed to make that 1783 map was what really precipitated the making of that map, which was the preliminary agreement to end the war. Because as I said, the Battle of Yorktown was in 1781, and Cornwallis surrendered October 19th, 1781, but things were really in limbo for a few years because an agreement had to happen. So there was a bit of a wait going on and a waiting period. And so that when there was a bit of news, like the preliminary discussions, then these, I think, very savvy and very smart map makers, you know, just got right into it. And I mean, why redo that entire map if you don't have to? And there's nothing wrong with that. That was common. Excuse me. How do these maps come to be part of New York Historical's collections? They come in different ways. Often in the early days, and what I mean by that is the decades after our founding in 1804, these would come in as along with someone's personal papers, family papers. We get a lot of things like broadsides and maps arrive like that. That's really the primary way. And then throughout decades and centuries even, there would be sets of maps that someone would donate from their personal collections. And less frequently, in fact, almost not at all, were maps purchased. So this was really a function of New York Historical Society making it known that we were collecting and we wanted to document American history. And so we were known to be the place, the repository for such things as Revolutionary War maps. And also individuals were collecting them. And so when they would give their collections, whether it was just maps or part of their personal papers, we would benefit by that, from that. Sorry, I'm just reading the questions as I go. How did the map makers get the information to create the large map? Oh, we did that one already, I think, from prior maps, yes. Did each map require recarving? How much time did it take? I actually don't know how much time it would take. It would have to do with how large the plate was and how experienced the engraver was, and also how much was new information and how much could be changed on the plate. Copper is very soft, and you can not sand it down, that's not the right term, but basically you can erase earlier incisions that were made with the tool, the metal tool. Let's see. Do you know why they seem to constantly change fonts in the text? It seems fairly random. That is a great question, and I wish I could just authoritatively tell you the answer, but I can't. My guess would be what font type they had on hand, and that would be in direct contrast to, say, contemporary designers who often their artistry reveals itself in terms of the mixing of fonts for a certain presentation look. And you know, there's a real art to making sure you combine certain fonts with other fonts, and knowing that if you do it poorly, it will look horrible. But my guess would be, and again, you can email me, would be that they had type font lying around that they, you know, they would have referred to. Let's see. Does New York Historical Society have a map of the Battle of Brooklyn that would indicate the location of Jamaica Pass? Is it available to the public to view? Wow, okay. We do have a map, Battle of Brooklyn, but I don't know if it has Jamaica Pass. And we are currently working on getting some of our digitized maps onto our digital repository. So let's see what we can do. You could email me about that. But I think that is a pretty in-depth reference question, and it may take a while to get back to you. I'll just say that. Were maps used in newspapers, either in their entirety or reproduced in part to make a point? Did journalists use maps as background to research their stories? I think journalists would have looked at maps, but it would depend on whether the maps had been created. So with all these maps of very current events, being the 3 that I spoke about being printed very quickly as a means of news. In other words, they're not replacing newspapers, but they are conveying the latest news. So it's not so much that any journalist would, you know, be breaking news his or herself. It would be more that the map itself would be the news. I'm not sure if I answered that fully, but yeah. Did the Americans have any prestigious map makers? Washington was a surveyor. Yes, he was. He was a very good surveyor. And we, speaking of Washington surveyors, the library at New York Historical also holds the manuscript surveys of Washington's cartographers, Robert Erskine and Simeon DeWitt. And these are manuscript maps. We hold about 285 of them. And they can be very hard to read. And when I mean read, I'm talking about reading both text and image, because they were done very quickly and they were classified information. They contain classified information. And getting back to map makers in the colonies and the new nation, there were not established map printers. There were established book printers, but map printing, of course, you needed a whole different group of equipment, and also you needed the expertise, and it just had not happened yet in the colonies. Also, it's where the war was going on. So supplies, if there had been map making enterprises, it would have been very difficult to have the supply chain continue. And in fact, those in the colonies who wanted to buy these gorgeous maps printed in London, once the embargo went into effect, trade embargo between the colonies and England, you would have to get that map through France. So it was a bit of a trade loophole to do that. Do any of these maps ever go on display? Well, 3 years ago, I had the pleasure of curating the New York Historical venue presentation of an exhibit that started at the Leventhal Center, Boston Public Library, called We Are One. It was fantastic, and I worked with the curator of the exhibit and a map collector, Richard Brown, and they were both so supportive of the goal of getting New York Historical Society maps into the exhibit. And we had about 25 of them. And that exhibit was mostly all maps, but we've also displayed maps in a lot of other exhibits, including the Battle of Brooklyn, which was on view about a year before my mapping exhibit. What do you mean by the term manuscript map? It's another good question. Manuscript just means handwritten or hand-drawn. It's from the Latin manus, script, to write. And so these would be maps that, if I were to take a piece of paper right now and start sketching my street, and that would be a manuscript map. If I were to take it to a printer and the printer would engrave it and make a print from it, that would be printed. But the differences can get really murky sometimes, because manuscript maps during the Revolution were created from printed maps, or at least referred to printed maps as they were being made. And also manuscript maps were copied. So you could say it's an original, everything manuscript is original, but often surveys would be copied. So you'd have somebody do the survey and then you'd have somebody make a copy of it, or a second copy of it. Who gets to decide what decorations will be used for the map's title? I have seen a map of Maryland, Virginia with a plain decoration, also the same map with figures, including slaves. I think I know the map you're talking about. Is it possible that this map was reprinted without the slaves? Yes, and that would be the printer. Sometimes the words printer and publisher are used interchangeably. Publisher suggests the business aspect. And so somebody could be a printer, but not have the full shop. They could work in a shop for a publisher. But whoever was going to sell the map would make the decisions about the cartouche, which is the decorative border in which the title is put, but often, as you pointed out, some illustrations as well. And that could definitely change. That could change just the way that any redo of a copper plate can be changed. So too could be the illustrations. How many copies of each map were printed? That's another very, very good question. And I would love to be able to tell you for each map how many were printed. And I mean, it helps to keep in mind that this is hand printing, right? Nothing is mechanized, I mean, mechanical. So after the engraver's done all that tremendous work of getting the images and text into that plate, they then have to roll the paper has to be, I'm not saying this as smoothly as I would like to. It was physically draining, and also, it took time. So again, I don't want to say something that's completely off, but I would say maybe dozens at a time. So now we have concluded our Q&A. I'm sorry to say, unfortunately. Let me just close this down. And we do look forward to seeing you back here in 2 weeks on November 18th for the next episode of Curator Confidential. which will be Mort Gerber Cartoons, A New Yorker's Perspective. Join Marilyn Kushner, curator and head of the Department of Prints, Photographs, and Architectural Collections at New York Historical, as she talks with Mort Gerber, celebrated cartoonist and author who's best known for his work in The New Yorker, the Saturday Evening Post, and other major publications. Thanks for joining me tonight, and I hope you have a great evening.